The Oprah Winfrey Network studio in Los Angeles was set up for what was supposed to be one of the most anticipated political interviews of the year. The lighting was warm and intimate, designed to create the kind of comfortable atmosphere that had defined Oprah's interviewing style for decades. Two cream-colored chairs sat angled toward each other on a stage, decorated with soft, neutral tones and carefully arranged flowers. 3 cameras were positioned to capture every angle of the conversation that was about to unfold. Oprah Winfrey, the legendary media mogul and cultural icon, sat in one chair wearing an elegant navy blue dress, her signature calm and knowing expression on her face. Across from her sat Representative Jasmine Crockett from Texas, the 43-year-old Democratic Congresswoman who had become one of the most prominent progressive voices in American politics since her election in 2022. Crockett wore a professional burgundy suit, her natural hair styled in a sleek manner, looking confident and prepared for what she expected would be a thoughtful conversation about her work in Congress and her vision for the country. What neither the audience nor Crockett fully anticipated was that this interview would take a dramatically different turn than anyone expected, culminating in a moment so tense and so perfectly handled by Crockett that it would effectively end the interview and spark a national conversation about media bias, respectful discourse, and the treatment of progressive politicians. Before we get into the full story of what happened during this explosive interview, make sure to hit that like button right now and subscribe to this channel so you never miss the political moments that everyone will be talking about tomorrow. Drop a comment telling us where you are watching from and whether you think traditional media figures like Oprah treat progressive politicians fairly, or whether there is a built-in bias against bold political voices. Now let us dive into exactly what went down and why Jasmine Crockett's response became one of the most talked-about interview moments of the decade. Oprah Winfrey had built her media empire on a particular interviewing style that combined empathy, curiosity, and the ability to create moments of genuine human connection. Over her decades-long career, she had interviewed presidents and celebrities, criminals and heroes, creating television moments that entered the cultural consciousness. Her book club selections became instant bestsellers. Her endorsements could launch careers or products into the stratosphere. When she decided to get involved in politics, her influence was undeniable. Her endorsement of Barack Obama in 2008 was credited with helping him secure the Democratic nomination and ultimately the presidency. Her interview with Prince Harry and Meghan Markle became one of the most watched television events in recent memory. At 70 years old, Oprah remained one of the most powerful figures in American media, with the ability to shape conversations and influence public opinion through her platforms. Her political views had evolved over the years from generally liberal to more centrist and pragmatic. She had relationships with wealthy donors, business leaders, and establishment political figures across the spectrum. While she supported Democratic candidates and progressive causes in general, she had also expressed concerns about what she viewed as the more radical elements of the progressive movement, worrying that they would alienate moderate voters and make it harder for Democrats to win elections. When Oprah's team reached out to book Jasmine Crockett for an interview, it seemed like a natural fit. Crockett had become one of the most visible and compelling new voices in Democratic politics. Her background as a civil rights attorney, her powerful speeches on the House floor, and her viral social media moments had made her a star among young progressives and a lightning rod for conservative criticism. An interview with Oprah would give Crockett a platform to reach beyond her base and speak to a broader audience that might not follow congressional politics closely but did watch Oprah's content. For Oprah, having Crockett on her show would demonstrate her connection to the next generation of Democratic leadership and give her audience insight into where the party was heading. Crockett's team saw it as an opportunity to humanize their congresswoman, to show the person behind the fiery speeches, and to explain her policy positions in a format that allowed for depth and nuance rather than just sound bites. The interview began warmly enough. Oprah opened by asking Crockett about her background, her childhood in Street Louis, her decision to become a civil rights attorney, and what motivated her to run for Congress. Crockett answered thoughtfully, telling stories about growing up in a working-class family, witnessing injustice in her community, and feeling called to fight for people who did not have a voice. Oprah nodded along, asking follow-up questions that seemed designed to draw out the emotional and personal aspects of Crockett's journey. The conversation flowed naturally as they discussed Crockett's early days in Congress, the challenges of being a freshman representative, and the excitement of finally being in a position to push for the changes she had spent her legal career advocating for. The audience in the studio seemed engaged, and the interview appeared to be going exactly as planned. But then the tone began to shift. Oprah started asking questions about Crockett's policy positions, and her framing revealed a perspective that surprised Crockett and her team. When Crockett talked about her support for Medicare for all, Oprah interrupted her explanation to ask how she would pay for it and whether she was concerned about the millions of people employed by private insurance companies who would lose their jobs. When Crockett tried to explain that the transition plan included provisions for those workers and that the overall benefits of universal health care far outweighed the disruption, Oprah cut her off again to say that she had spoken to many business leaders who were very concerned about government-run health care and whether it would stifle innovation. Crockett noticed the pattern immediately. Every time she tried to explain a progressive policy position, Oprah would interrupt with a question that framed the policy as radical, expensive, or impractical. The questions themselves were not necessarily unfair, as these were concerns that many moderate voters genuinely had. But the constant interruptions and the framing suggested that Oprah had already decided the progressive position was wrong and was using her questions to lead Crockett to either defend herself or admit that the policies were unrealistic. When the conversation turned to economic policy, the interruptions intensified. Crockett was explaining her support for raising taxes on the wealthy and closing corporate tax loopholes when Oprah jumped in to ask whether she was concerned about being labeled a socialist and whether that label would hurt Democrats in swing districts. Before Crockett could fully respond, Oprah interrupted again to mention that she had heard from many moderate Democrats who felt the party was moving too far left and alienating the voters they needed to win elections. Crockett tried to explain that polling actually showed strong support for progressive economic policies among working-class voters of all political backgrounds, but Oprah cut her off once more to say that she had to push back on that because the conventional wisdom among political strategists was that Democrats needed to move to the center to win. The interview was no longer a conversation. It had become an interrogation, with Oprah constantly challenging Crockett's positions from a centrist establishment perspective and not giving her adequate time to fully explain or defend her views. Crockett remained calm and professional through these interruptions, but her team watching from backstage was growing increasingly frustrated. This was not what they had been told to expect from this interview. The pre-interview conversations with Oprah's producers had suggested that this would be a thoughtful exploration of Crockett's background and vision, not a debate over whether progressive policies were viable. More importantly, the constant interruptions were preventing Crockett from making her case effectively. Every time she tried to provide context or explain the reasoning behind her positions, Oprah would cut her off with a new question or challenge. It was becoming clear that Oprah had her own agenda for this interview, and it was not simply to give Crockett a platform to share her views. The audience could feel the tension building. Some looked uncomfortable with how aggressively Oprah was questioning her guest. Others seemed to agree with Oprah's skepticism about progressive policies. The cameras captured every moment of the increasingly strained interaction. The breaking point came when the conversation turned to criminal justice reform. Crockett had spent years as a civil rights attorney, fighting for people who had been wrongly convicted or victimized by an unjust criminal justice system. This was the issue she knew most intimately and cared about most deeply. She began explaining her legislative work to end qualified immunity for police officers, reform sentencing guidelines, and provide more funding for public defenders and rehabilitation programs. She was mid-sentence, talking about a specific case from her legal career that illustrated why these reforms were necessary, when Oprah interrupted her yet again. This time, the interruption was particularly jarring because Crockett had been telling a personal story about a client whose life had been destroyed by a wrongful conviction. Oprah cut her off to ask whether Crockett was concerned that her rhetoric about police reform made her sound anti-police, and whether that would hurt Democrats with suburban voters who cared about public safety. Crockett paused. She took a visible breath. The audience could see her making a decision in that moment about how to respond to this latest interruption. She had been patient and professional through all the previous interruptions, trying to answer Oprah's questions despite the hostile framing and the refusal to let her finish her thoughts. But this interruption was different. Oprah had cut her off while she was sharing a deeply personal story about her legal work, had dismissed that story without even acknowledging it, and had reduced her years of experience fighting for justice to a question about political messaging and electoral strategy. In that moment, Crockett decided she was done playing by the rules of an interview format that was clearly designed to undermine rather than illuminate her positions. Crockett held up her hand in a gesture that commanded attention. She looked directly at Oprah with an expression that combined disappointment, frustration, and determination. Then she spoke, and her words would instantly become one of the most viral interview moments of the year. She said, "Oprah, this is the 7th time you have interrupted me in the last 20 minutes. You have not let me finish a single explanation of my policy positions. You keep framing my views as radical or politically risky, without actually engaging with the substance of what I am saying. I came here expecting a conversation, But what you are doing is an interrogation designed to make progressive ideas look unreasonable. So let me be very clear. I spent 15 years as a civil rights attorney representing people who had no one else to fight for them. I have seen firsthand what happens when our criminal justice system, our healthcare system, and our economic system fail working people. I ran for Congress to change those systems. If that makes me too radical for your show, or for establishment Democrats who are more concerned with political consultants than with the people we are supposed to represent, then maybe we should just end this interview right now, because I am not going to sit here and be treated like my life's work is just a political liability to be managed. The studio fell completely silent. The audience sat frozen, unsure how to react. Oprah's expression shifted through several emotions in rapid succession: surprise, indignation, defensiveness, and then something that looked like recognition that this had gone in a direction she had not anticipated. The cameras captured every second of the tense standoff. Crockett sat back in her chair, her posture conveying that she had said what she needed to say and was waiting to see how Oprah would respond. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 5 or 6 seconds. Then Oprah spoke, and her response revealed the fundamental disconnect that had created this confrontation. She said that she was just asking the questions that her audience wanted answered, that she had a responsibility to challenge her guests and push them to defend their positions, and that if Crockett could not handle tough questions, then maybe she was not ready for the national stage. The condescension in that response was unmistakable. Oprah was suggesting that Crockett was being oversensitive or unprepared, when in reality, Crockett had just articulated a legitimate criticism of how the interview was being conducted. Crockett did not raise her voice, but her next words had the force of a knockout punch. She said, "Tough questions are fine, Oprah. I welcome tough questions. What I do not accept is being repeatedly interrupted and having my views mischaracterized. You have given me less time to explain my positions than you gave to defending the concerns of business leaders and political consultants. That is not journalism. That is bias. And the fact that you think the problem here is that I cannot handle tough questions rather than acknowledging that you have been conducting this interview in bad faith tells me everything I need to know. Thank you for your time, but I think we are done here." With that, Crockett stood up, removed her microphone, and walked off the set. The audience gasped. Oprah sat in her chair looking stunned. The producers scrambled to figure out what to do. The cameras kept rolling, capturing Oprah's shocked expression as she watched Crockett leave. No guest had ever walked out of an Oprah interview before. This was unprecedented. And within minutes, it would become the biggest entertainment and political story in the country. The studio audience did not know what to do. Some people started applauding Crockett as she walked off, clearly agreeing with her criticism of how the interview had been conducted. Others sat in uncomfortable silence. Oprah tried to recover, turning to the camera to say something about passionate political differences and the importance of civil discourse, but her words sounded hollow given what had just happened. The show's producers called for a break, and during that break, chaos erupted. Crockett's team was thrilled with how she had handled the situation, believing she had stood up for herself and exposed the bias in how establishment media figures treated progressive politicians. Oprah's team was panicking, trying to figure out how to salvage the situation and whether they should even air the interview, given how badly it had gone. Meanwhile, people in the studio audience were already posting about what they had witnessed on social media, and word was spreading rapidly that something dramatic had happened during the taping. Within an hour, video clips started appearing online. Someone in the audience had recorded portions of the interview on their phone despite rules against doing so. The clips were shaky, and the audio was not perfect, but they were clear enough to show the repeated interruptions, Crockett's powerful response, and her decision to walk off the set. The clips went viral immediately. Twitter exploded with reactions from across the political spectrum. Progressive activists celebrated Crockett for refusing to be disrespected and for calling out media bias. They created hashtags like Respect Jasmine and Oprah Bias that quickly started trending. Young voters in particular loved that Crockett had stood up for herself, rather than just taking the treatment she was getting. They shared the clips widely and praised her for showing that progressive politicians did not have to accept bad faith questioning from establishment media figures, even ones as powerful and beloved as Oprah. The reaction from moderate Democrats and Oprah's fans was more mixed. Some felt that Crockett had been disrespectful to a legendary interviewer, and that walking out of an interview was unprofessional and immature. They argued that politicians needed to be able to handle tough questioning, and that Crockett had overreacted to what was just normal journalistic pushback. Others who watched the clips more carefully acknowledged that the interruptions had been excessive, and that Oprah did seem to be approaching the interview with a predetermined bias against progressive policies. Even some of Oprah's longtime fans admitted that they were disappointed in how she had conducted the interview, and that Crockett's criticism seemed legitimate. Conservative media gleefully amplified the story, portraying it as evidence of Democrats eating their own, and of how the progressive wing of the party was hostile to anyone who questioned their radical agenda. Fox News ran segments analyzing the confrontation and praising Crockett for at least being honest about her far-left positions, even while criticizing those positions themselves. The mainstream political media coverage was intense and largely sympathetic to Crockett. Journalists who had themselves experienced Oprah's interviewing style acknowledged that she could be more aggressive and leading in her questions than her warm public image suggested. Several media critics wrote pieces analyzing the interview and concluding that Oprah had indeed been unfairly interrupting Crockett and framing her positions in a negative light without giving her adequate opportunity to explain them. The consensus among political journalists was that Crockett had been right to call out the bias, and that her decision to walk out, while dramatic, was justified given the circumstances. This mainstream media support was important because it meant the story was not just a social media phenomenon but a legitimate news story covered seriously by major outlets. Oprah's initial response through her representatives was defensive. A statement from her team said that she had simply been doing her job as an interviewer, asking challenging questions and pushing her guests to defend her positions. The statement suggested that Crockett had been unprepared for serious scrutiny and had walked out rather than answer difficult questions. But this narrative did not hold up once the full video of the interview began circulating. The Oprah Winfrey Network initially did not plan to air the interview at all, viewing it as a disaster that would damage Oprah's reputation. But once clips were already going viral and the story was dominating the news cycle, they decided they had to release the full interview so people could see the complete context rather than just the most dramatic moments. When they aired the full interview 2 days later, it only confirmed what Crockett had said. The pattern of interruptions was undeniable. Oprah did repeatedly cut Crockett off mid-explanation. She did frame progressive policies in the most negative and challenging light possible, and she did not show the same deference and patience that she typically showed to other guests, particularly moderate or conservative political figures. The ratings for the full interview were enormous, as millions of people tuned in to see what all the controversy was about. But the reaction to watching the complete interview was overwhelmingly supportive of Crockett. Even people who had initially thought she might have overreacted changed their minds after seeing how persistently Oprah had interrupted her and how patient Crockett had been before finally pushing back. The interview became a case study in media bias and the different treatment that progressive politicians received compared to more establishment figures. Media studies professors used it in their classes to teach about framing, bias, and the subtle ways that interviewers can undermine or support their guests through the questions they ask and how they conduct the conversation. Political communication experts analyzed it as an example of how traditional media figures often approached progressive politicians with skepticism and hostility, while giving centrist and conservative figures much more respectful treatment. The aftermath of the interview had significant implications for both Oprah and Crockett. For Oprah, it was one of the few genuine controversies of her long career. She was accustomed to being celebrated and beloved, not criticized and called out for bias. The criticism from progressives was particularly intense, with many pointing out that despite her history of supporting progressive causes, she seemed to have more sympathy for wealthy business leaders and establishment politicians than for the progressive elected officials actually fighting for transformative change. Some accused her of being so wealthy and so embedded in elite circles that she had lost touch with the concerns of working people and could not see the value in bold, progressive policies. The controversy damaged her reputation among young progressives, who had admired her but now saw her as part of the establishment that was resistant to the change they wanted. Oprah eventually issued a longer statement acknowledging that the interview had not gone as she had hoped and that perhaps she had been too aggressive in her questioning. She stopped short of fully apologizing to Crockett, instead offering a more general statement about respecting different viewpoints and the importance of listening to all voices within the Democratic coalition. But the qualified nature of her acknowledgement satisfied no one. Progressives felt she had not genuinely taken responsibility for her bias. Moderates felt she had caved to pressure from the left. The whole situation was a no-win scenario for Oprah, and it marked a rare moment where her tremendous cultural power and influence were not enough to control the narrative. Crockett had successfully challenged that power and come out looking stronger, which was almost unheard of in interactions with someone of Oprah's stature. For Jasmine Crockett, the interview and its aftermath were transformative. She went from being a rising star among progressives to a national figure known to a much broader audience. Her willingness to walk out of an Oprah interview and her articulate explanation of why she was doing so resonated far beyond her existing base. Working-class people of all political backgrounds appreciated that she refused to be talked down to or disrespected. Young women, particularly young black women, saw her as a role model who demanded respect and would not tolerate condescension even from powerful establishment figures. Her congressional office was flooded with supportive messages. Her campaign received a surge of small-dollar donations from people who had not previously supported her but were inspired by her courage. Her social media following exploded, gaining millions of new followers across all platforms. Political organizations on the left immediately recognized the power of what Crockett had done and sought to replicate it. Progressive groups started training candidates and elected officials on how to push back against biased media questioning without being disrespectful, but also without being doormats. Crockett's response to Oprah became the template. Remain calm, clearly articulate what the problem is, give the interviewer a chance to correct course, and then be willing to end the interaction if the bias continues. It was a master class in standing up for yourself while maintaining professionalism and dignity. The fact that she had done it to Oprah Winfrey, one of the most powerful media figures in the world, made the lesson even more powerful. If you could stand up to Oprah, you could stand up to anyone. The interview also sparked important conversations within the Democratic Party about how establishment figures and moderate Democrats treated the progressive wing. Many progressives had long felt that they were viewed with suspicion and hostility by party leaders and mainstream media figures, who saw them as a threat to electability and donor relationships. The Oprah interview crystallized these tensions in a very public way. It forced Democrats to confront the reality that there was a significant portion of the party that felt disrespected and marginalized by the establishment, and that this internal tension was harming the party's ability to build a broad coalition. Some Democratic leaders called for more internal dialogue and mutual respect. Others dismissed the controversy as overblown and insisted that progressives needed to accept that they were a minority faction within the party and could not expect to dictate terms to the majority. The media coverage of the interview evolved over time, from focusing on the dramatic confrontation itself to analyzing what it revealed about political discourse in America. Commentators noted that the same establishment figures who constantly called for civility and unity in politics were often the ones being least civil to progressive politicians who were trying to represent their constituents and push for bold change. The double standard was striking. When progressives criticized moderate Democrats or pushed for bolder policies, they were accused of causing division and hurting the party. But when establishment figures like Oprah repeatedly interrupted and dismissed progressive politicians, it was framed as just asking tough questions. Crockett's walkout forced people to confront this double standard and ask whether the calls for unity were really about unity or about progressives staying quiet and accepting their subordinate position within the party. In the months following the interview, other progressive politicians started being more assertive in pushing back against biased media treatment. When interviewers tried to trap them with loaded questions or repeatedly interrupted them, they called it out rather than just accepting it. They cited Crockett's example as proof that pushing back could work and that audiences actually appreciated politicians who stood up for themselves rather than being punching bags. This shift in how progressives engaged with media made interviews more contentious, but also more honest. Interviewers could no longer take it for granted that progressive politicians would simply accept whatever framing or treatment they were given. They had to be more careful about showing basic respect and allowing their guests to actually explain their positions. The Crockett-Oprah confrontation also had implications for how political interviews were conducted more broadly. Producers and interviewers became more conscious of interruption patterns and whether they were treating all guests equally. Media criticism became more focused on these dynamics, with journalists and commentators analyzing not just what was said in interviews but how the conversations were conducted, whether guests were given fair opportunities to speak, and whether interviewers were approaching their subjects with good faith or with predetermined narratives they were trying to confirm. This increased scrutiny led to somewhat better practices in political journalism, though bias and unfair treatment certainly did not disappear. Looking back on the interview, it became clear that both Oprah and Crockett had miscalculated in different ways, but that Crockett's miscalculation worked in her favor, while Oprah's backfired dramatically. Crockett had assumed she would get a fair and respectful interview from Oprah, which turned out to be wrong. But her decision to walk out when that expectation was not met turned a potentially negative situation into a defining positive moment for her career. Oprah had assumed she could challenge and interrogate Crockett without facing any real pushback, that her status and power meant she could conduct the interview however she wanted. That assumption proved catastrophically wrong when Crockett refused to accept the treatment and called it out publicly. The encounter was a reminder that power dynamics in media and politics were shifting, that younger politicians understood how to use social media and public opinion to their advantage. and that even the most powerful establishment figures could not take their authority for granted anymore. The interview remained a reference point in political discussions for years afterward. Whenever someone walked out of an interview or pushed back against an interviewer, commentators would reference pulling a Jasmine Crockett as shorthand for standing up to unfair treatment. Whenever establishment Democrats complained about progressives being difficult or divisive, progressives would point to the Oprah interview as evidence that the real problem was establishment bias and disrespect. The moment had become part of the political lexicon, a shared cultural reference that everyone understood, represented something important about the tensions within the Democratic coalition and the changing dynamics of political media. For Jasmine Crockett personally, the interview solidified her position as one of the most important progressive voices in American politics. She had shown that she would not compromise her principles or accept disrespect in pursuit of mainstream approval. She had demonstrated the kind of courage and clarity that her supporters wanted from their representatives. And she had done it all while remaining articulate, professional, and focused on the substantive issues rather than just personal grievances. These qualities made her a formidable political figure with a bright future. Speculation began about whether she might run for Senate or even eventually for president. While she consistently said she was focused on her work in the House, political observers noted that she had exactly the kind of profile and skills that could translate to higher office if she chose to pursue it. The story of Oprah interrupting Jasmine Crockett and Crockett's response that ended the interview became more than just an entertaining piece of political drama. It became a symbol of larger struggles over who gets respected in political discourse, whose voices are taken seriously, and how power operates in media and politics. It showed that challenging established power could work, that speaking truth could resonate even when directed at beloved figures, and that sometimes the most powerful response to disrespect was simply refusing to participate in it any longer. Those lessons extended far beyond this single interview to shape how progressives approached media, how interviewers thought about their responsibilities, and how audiences evaluated the political coverage they consumed. If you found this analysis of the Oprah and Jasmine Crockett interview confrontation valuable, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel immediately. We provide the deep dives into political moments that matter, explaining not just what happened but why it matters and what it tells us about American politics today. Comment below with your perspective on whether Crockett handled the situation correctly or whether she should have stayed and continued the interview despite the interruptions. Let us know if you think establishment media treats progressive politicians fairly or if there is a systematic bias that needs to be called out more often. Share this video with anyone who needs to understand how power dynamics in media work and how politicians can effectively push back against unfair treatment. This is the kind of insightful political analysis you will only find right here, so make sure you are subscribed with notifications turned on so you never miss our breakdowns of the confrontations, strategies, and moments that are defining contemporary American politics.